In class, we went over 3 different unethical situations related to psychology, which were the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, and what happened at Abu Ghraib. First, with the Milgram experiment, participants were invited to take a memory test, and once they arrived at the location of the experiment, they were told that they would either be a teacher or a learner. And it was set up so that actors were the learners and the random participants were the teachers. So the teachers would read off a list of words and then ask the participant questions related to the words, and every time the participant got one wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock, and the shocks increased in voltage to 450 volts, which was fatal. So the purpose of the experiment was actually to test how far the participant would go in administering the shocks, even though they heard the pained cries of the learner. And they found that it was very unlikely that the teacher would stop administering the shocks. But they got this data in a kind of unethical way, because every time the teacher protested, there was an authority figure in the room, like a supervisor, who would tell them that they had to keep on going and that it was in the greater good of science. And another really unethical part of that was that they waited a really long time to tell the unknowing participants that they actually weren't hurting anybody. So they could have gone months with thinking that maybe they killed someone. With the next experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, the participants signed up to either be a prisoner and a guard in a staged prison situation. But they didn't know how far the experiment would go and how realistic it would become. Right off the bat, they treated the participants like prisoners, and they stripped them of their masculinity and made them dress like smocks without underwear, so they felt really vulnerable and dehumanized. And the uniforms of the guards were really authoritative, and they became really sadistic, and they felt like they had to enforce their masculinity. And the prisoners had a lot of emotional breakdowns. They forgot who they really were, and they began to think of themselves as just a number. And another really unethical part of it was that the leaders of the experiment manipulated the parents of the prisoners into thinking that everything was okay by dolling up the prison and filtering what came through in the letters that their sons sent home. It was good that they cut off the experiment before the 2 weeks that was supposed to have lasted, but really after the first or second time that the prisoners had a strike or the second prisoner had a mental breakdown, they should have shut it down. And the purpose of the experiment was to find how the guards would react to their positions of authority, and they discovered that everything went much too far. And with Abu Ghraib, this wasn't an experiment, but it was a real-life situation where American soldiers had authority over Iraqi prisoners, and they forgot that humans were still humans even if they have a different race or religion than you. And they really dehumanized the prisoners, and they used the prisoners' dead bodies as props. If selfies were popular back then, they probably would have taken a selfie with them. And they raped prisoners with broomsticks, they sodomized them with chemical lights, and they used fear as a psychological factor to harass them with guard dogs. And the worst part is that they made them pose naked in a really sexual way, which was against their religion, and it was psychological torture for them. And this told us about human behavior, that sometimes people take power way too far, and in all 3 of the situations they just became infatuated with power, and that's what made it unethical.